50 years. A lot can change in 50 years. For reference, in the 70s, modern cell phones didn't exist, nor did the internet. Something that is so normal now could barely be fathomed back then, with the advent of computers still yet to come. However, back then there was one thing that still existed that doesn't now, a human presence on the moon. Sure, the International Space Station still exists, but there has never been a manned spaceflight to the moon or a flight beyond low Earth orbit since Apollo 17 back in 1972. This isn't to say that humanity hasn't been to space back then. Take, for example, the Discovery launch in 1997 with a crew of 6 members. Space flights still occurred, just not in the grandiose fashion that it once did. Today, commercial flights have ballooned in popularity. Companies like Boeing, SpaceX, and Blue Origin all allow customers to fly to space by low Earth orbit for a fee. The best example of this is Katy Perry in the Blue Origin rocket last year in April. Now, whether it's a good idea for space to be commercialized this early is a topic for another time. Regardless, it still brings the public perception to the space sector. I was in a NASA program once where I heard the lead investigator for the Lucy mission, Hal Levison, speak about how the public shapes the space sector. In his own words, the public is the sole reason we can do these programs. You always have to remind them of that, because the public loves to forget. This leads to another part of the story. Why did we stop going to space in the first place? To answer that, we have to go back in time during the return of the Apollo 17's crew. The Apollos 18 and 19 were both cut in favor of the Space Shuttle program, which wasn't helped by the fact that the budget for NASA had been cut time and time again from 1967, mostly in part due to public favor. After all, the biggest reason anyone was interested in the space race was due to our rivalry with the Soviet Union, whom we bested back in 1969. The aforementioned space shuttle finally launched in 1981, barely making it due to constant budget cuts and new technologies. The constant war with budgets is a permanent staple with any space mission. During this time, the focus was also shifted from returning to the moon to a more permanent research base in space, which would soon be known as the International Space Station, or the ISS. It also wasn't helped by the
Take it off.
horrific Challenger disaster that occurred in
2 minutes
1986,
15 seconds.
which was already
Velocity
covered on
2,900
this
feet per
channel.
second.
Following the disaster, NASA kept making blunder after blunder, with the key one being the discovery that the Hubble Space Telescope had a flawed mirror. Following the collapse of the US's biggest space competitor, the USSR, the public lost even more interest in returning to space. Then, the Columbia disaster in 2003 made people even less enthusiastic about space, leading NASA to have little room beyond keeping the shuttle and the ISS alive. In response to this, programs were announced, promising to bring humanity back to the moon in a distant future. However, this program was soon riddled with budget problems, falling behind schedule, and leading to it being shut down in 2010. However, despite being cancelled, miraculously, funding for a new booster and spacecraft, both based on the dead program, began creation. The notable part of this is the Space Launch System, or the SLS, which is being used in the Artemis II mission being launched later this year. Then, during the late 2000s, the Artemis program was funded, promising to bring humans back to the moon as soon as possible. The reason why humanity hasn't returned to the moon is multifaceted, to say the least. It was over budget, behind schedule, riddled with administrative errors, horrific disasters, and, probably most importantly, lack of public interest. This is why the commercialization of space has brought the spotlight back to a field which was previously overlooked. The Artemis II mission is only the second of 8 missions, possibly more, planned for humanity's return to space. The 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, who is the commander of the mission, Victor Glover, who is the pilot, and Christiana Koch and Jeremy Hansen as mission specialists. Notably, the last three would be the first person of color, woman, and non-American to travel beyond low Earth orbit, respectively. Since I love space, I really am intrigued to see what the next step for the humanity's presence in space is. Is it a nuclear reactor on the moon? Is it a lunar colony? Who can really tell apart from those who plan the missions? My name is Kirakid, and I thank you all for watching this short documentary about the return to the moon.